Hi there, I'm Jackson Cantrell. I regret that I cannot be joining you all live today, but I do believe that the legacy of these individuals needs to be remembered and to be shared. Therefore, I've prepared this recording for your benefit and for theirs. Please bear with me one moment. Hello, everyone. I'd like to express my gratitude at having the opportunity to present this truly unique story set in the outskirts of New Orleans in the mid-1800s. And although I do indeed know each person from the Fontainebleau plantation by name, there are no photos or sketches of these individuals on record. I have included, however, images of others who lived in the same time period. They are not substitutes or stand-ins, but they did have parallel experiences, and I regard them all with due respect. Before we begin, this is sort of an agenda, if you will. I'd like to start with historical context. What was going on in Louisiana and the wider world had a direct impact on the men of Fontainebleau. They were affected by building booms, global health, economic disasters, as well as Louisiana law. From there, we'll talk about the work at the Fontainebleau plantation, as well as we'll discuss certain free people of color before finishing out. I do thank all of you for your interest in these individuals whose stories before 2019 were almost exclusively unknown. The men and their families lived from 1829 to 1862 at a place that was very different from others of the time. Here are their names. Those shown in red, blue, or gold are people who have additional interesting details, some of whom I'll mention today. I'd like to start with some local geography. On this 1848 map by La Tourette, please notice all the plantations along the Mississippi River. Transporting timber, indigo, sugar, rice, and cotton to New Orleans was simple and profitable for slaveholders and their backers. In 1840, the city was the fourth largest port in the world and a major center for trade. Lake Pontchartrain, as you can see, is just north of the city. And on its far shore are blue and red stars from my hometown of Mandeville and the Fontainebleau plantation, now a state park. Arriving there in the 1800s would involve a 2.5-hour trip by steamboat or 9 hours by delivery schooner. These sites were founded by Bernard de Marigny de Mandeville. He owned 3 older properties on the South Shore too. Those may be where many of Fontainebleau's families came from. It's the blue star adjacent to New Orleans where our story begins. Please notice the blue dashed line, a canal that connects that star to the lake. It was built 100 years before this map was drawn. Here is that canal. It and the surrounding land were originally the property of shipbuilder Claude de Brule. The canal was built in 1748 by West African men who were enslaved by de Brule. They surveyed, designed, and excavated all 5 miles of it. This canal captured powerful currents off the Mississippi River, and not only did this power a large sawmill, but it connected the river and the lake. The year that this map was drawn, 1798, the heirs of Claude de Brule sold the property to Pierre Philippe de Marigny, excuse me. Other than the Jesuit plantations upstream, cypress swamps were all that existed outside the fortified town. This map was about to change dramatically. So too were the lives of enslaved men. The new owner, Pierre Philippe de Marigny, owned the canal and property marked here in yellow for only 2 years. He died suddenly in 1800, passing it to his 15-year-old son, Bernard. When Bernard turned 20, he had the enslaved workers clear and subdivide the land. He then made a fortune selling those lots, and he named the subdivision the Faubourg Marigny, which is what it's still called today. Marigny then instructed his enslaved workers to deepen, widen, and reinforce the old sawmill canal. By doing so, cargo ships could travel between the river and Lake Pontchartrain. This was incredibly important for trade. And by 1832, it also held the tracks for the first railroad in the region. As a side note, one of the train's first passengers was likely a 23-year-old tourist from Illinois. He was visiting New Orleans that season and would soon run for office, advocating for Western railroads. That 23-year-old was none other than Abraham Lincoln. So, with the success of the Faubourg Marigny development, it's no wonder that Marigny later bought land on the North Shore for another real estate venture. First, he acquired a massive cattle ranch that would soon become Fontainebleau. It's marked red here. Next, he bought land to create the new town that would become Mandeville. On New Year's Day of 1834, he began advertising property sales. Many already know of the three most important things in real estate, those being location, location, and location. But the fourth attribute, lesser known, is timing. And for Bernard, timing could not have been better. Only 2 months before the lots were advertised, a second wave of the infamous cholera pandemic hit New Orleans. As we all know, pandemic outbreaks come in surges. And when New Orleans' second peak hit in late October 1833, 1 person out of every 10 fell dead. New canals that were being excavated were suddenly needed for mass graves. The enslaved, free people of color, and whites were dying in droves. Those with poor living conditions, of course, suffered the worst. New Orleanians were desperate to escape the contagion, and Mandeville, to them, seemed like a sanctuary. When sales opened, Bernard made today's equivalent of $3 million in just the first 3 days. Through him, new owners could also hire craftsmen to build their homes. It was one-stop shopping. He arranged the services of master carpenters, brick masons, and artisans. Wheelwrights, coopers, and blacksmiths were ready for quick hire. Sam, a fresco artist, could paint your fireplace mantle to look like expensive marble. Antoine, the French-trained pastry chef, might create fancy confections for special events. Ned Cordonnier made beautiful boots. Marigny also owned the Foray, a cargo schooner that delivered the homeowners' furniture from New Orleans. The Foray also brought in cases of French wine, Italian olive oil, fine china, coffee, and Cuban rum. The talented workforce necessary for all this, of course, was the enslaved men of Fontainebleau. Here are a few houses that they built. Now, just as he did in the Faubourg Marigny, Bernard marketed to both whites and free people of color. The house on the upper right was built on one of the many investment parcels owned by Athalie Drouillard. She was a free woman of color from New Orleans. At the time, 20% of the New Orleans population was made up of free people of color. Many, like Bernard's half-sister Eulalie de Mandeville, were incredibly wealthy. Eulalie was born enslaved but was freed at age 5 and raised by their affluent grandmother. She became a highly successful businesswoman with an estate estimated at $5 million in today's dollars. Athalie and Eulalie were not alone in success. In 1840, the property holdings of New Orleans free people of color amounted to $79 million in today's dollars. Some were merchants and craftsmen, while others were extremely prominent. Well educated, they sent their children to study abroad. They supported the arts, the Catholic Church, debutante balls, and benevolent societies. Louisiana's French Code Noir, adopted in 1685, gave these individuals similar legal rights to whites, with 3 exceptions. They could not vote, hold public office, or legally marry a white person. Louisiana's laws also allowed that if the slaveholder agreed, an enslaved person could purchase his freedom, or that of his family members. When they were hired out for services, the enslaved were often permitted to keep a portion of their earnings. Family men knew to buy the freedom of one's wife or daughters first. But why? Children of free women were themselves free. And the babies of enslaved women were born as slaves, even if their fathers were free. Here are where some of the enslaved families lived. These are enslaved quarters at the Whitney and Evergreen plantations. If you've ever seen the movie Django Unchained, or if you watch the upcoming film Emancipation, you'll instantly recognize Evergreen. Its cabins in Oak Alley are identical to those that existed at Fontainebleau. Fontainebleau is on the right. Its quarters were washed away by hurricanes, but underneath the roots of the Oak Alley, you can still see remnants of the brick chimney hearths. In 1840, 20 double cabins and 2 singles housed 153 enslaved family members at Fontainebleau. They built and operated a self-sustaining village and hospital, a transportation center for ships, and an industrial complex. This is Fontainebleau today. Using information from 2 archaeological surveys, the brick building foundations are shown in red and blue. Notice the former quarters in blue. They were in 2 rows under the Alley of Oaks. The industrial park for bricks, lumber, and sugar is in red on the very far right. They built the complex almost a mile from the lake to avoid flooding from storm surges. They designed a canal as a transport route for barges. And at the industrial center, the barges were loaded with products, and then teams of oxen, would pull the barges down the canal to a wharf. There, the items were then loaded onto the schooner Faray for delivery. Next to the loading docks was a small warehouse. The Faray was loaded here, as were ships from other North Shore manufacturers. It was a marine trade hub. Passengers from the steamship Blackhawk arrived twice a week on a separate pier. At 4,800 acres, Fontainebleau was a massive undertaking. But who managed this extensive enterprise? This is a printout of what I have called the lost 1840 census. The original, of course, was handwritten. Misfiled for over a century, I stumbled onto it in 2018. Until then, park officials had no idea of the huge population of enslaved individuals held there. Of the 153 people living in bondage at Fontainebleau, 57 were children under the age of 10. And in Louisiana, a 10-year-old's birthday was a major event. From that day forward, the child could be legally sold away from his or her mother, but in other states, that age was 5. This particular census was highly unusual because it specified sugar makers, manufacturers, and mariners. In letters of the time, plantation owners remarked upon the unusual fact that there were only 3 freemen at Fontainebleau. The enslaved were the site's primary operators. Here is Fontainebleau's industrial complex, shown on the upper right. Today, only its brick chimneys and a few walls still stand. From old letters, we know that the enterprise was entirely unique in its design and its operation. Everything was interconnected to a massive state-of-the-art steam engine. It powered 2 sugar presses and conveyor belts, plus the sawmill. Also interconnected were clay mixers. This partly automated brick making and made it Fontainebleau's most profitable endeavor. Once the bricks and other products were manufactured, they were barged down the canal to the schooner. A 10-man crew of navigators then sailed them to New Orleans and likely returned the following day. Although I had known about the delivery schooner Faray until I found the misfiled census from 1840, it never dawned on me that the crew sailing it for decades were enslaved men. I went and checked sales records from 1852, and sure enough, they were there again. I was 16 when I found this information, and I found myself asking, why? Why didn't these men take the ship and make a run for it? And while we can never know for certain, I am of the opinion that they stayed for their families. Here are their families, listed by name as collateral on 6 separate loans. When the 1837 economic crisis hit the nation, it lasted for 14 years. Businesses across the country failed by the thousands. Property owners mortgaged their holdings, including the enslaved. Fontainebleau's families were mortgaged 6 different times before being sold off. Less than half remained on site. You'll remember that the census didn't show people by name. Banks, however, insisted that names be recorded, even those of newborns. Should shareholders need to foreclose and seize the quote-unquote property, they wanted each person differentiated by monetary value. Antoine, the pastry chef, and Sam, the fresco painter, would fetch more at auction than field hands. The translators, Amy Kentucky and Lucille American, were even more valuable. So too were the schooner captains, Ned and Valerie. Frosine was 40 years old, but the fact that her youngest child was only 6 months old meant that she could still bear children. As in 1808, it became illegal to import slaves from outside the US, women were more valuable if they could reproduce. Let's consider the toddlers named Israel and Lisa. Their 29-year-old mom was named Mary Bill. Children had far less market value than adults, but they were bundled with the grown-ups as specie on the loan. Investors preferred that groups of enslaved people be mortgaged together. In the event of injury or death of a high-value person, banks could spread their risk across a group. It functioned just like a mutual fund. The idea started with life insurance on human cargo in the transatlantic slave trade. The best way to research the enslaved, unfortunately, is to follow the money. I'd like to go back now and talk more about the navigators. When I was first reading through Fontainebleau's mortgages, I came to find out that Ned and Valerie Golette weren't in fact brothers, but schooner captains, as the French word for schooner is golette. I was surprised to learn about them and their crew, but as it turns out, I shouldn't have been surprised, and I should have known better. Mariners of color were very common in that time period, and by the 1820s, 20% of all US sailors were African Americans. Many were enslaved men hired out for fees. Others were free men who carried papers with them while in ports like New Orleans, showing their legal status. Steamships, regardless of who their crews were important in the slave trade. Between the years 1800 and 1862, more than 70,000 enslaved individuals were bound and shipped to New Orleans by steamboat. Before and after the Civil War, hundreds of enslaved and free men of color also worked as master shipbuilders, caulkers, and steamboat engineers. They served as steamship captains like Gilbert Burton, but also commanded schooners and barges throughout the Gulf Coast. One local lumber company employed 40 such captains to run its entire fleet of lumber schooners. There was also an oyster company based just 20 miles from Fontainebleau. Its owners, captains, and crews were African American. The name of the company was Fountain Oysters. The similar names to Fontainebleau made me wonder if they had come from Fontainebleau, but I simply do not know. Finally, if you'll indulge me, I have one last slide about others whose stories I didn't know until recently. In the interest of time, I'll only mention one man who lived 7 miles from Fontainebleau. Notice the old courthouse in the lower right. Philip Bruxton, his wife Jenny, and their 2 young daughters were brought to the area in the early 1800s. The family of 4 was enslaved. As I mentioned earlier, Louisiana laws, with the permission of the land and slave owner, allowed enslaved individuals to earn money and purchase their freedom. Philip purchased Jenny, his wife's freedom, before his own, and by doing so, their youngest child, a baby boy, was born as a free man, while his father, Philip, was still enslaved. This is the courthouse where their papers were filed. In closing, I hope these stories about the men of Fontainebleau and beyond might resound with you, but it's the people who live so near my home that mean the most to me. When I installed this marker in 2019, my simple goal was to honor those whose lives lay unknown, and my wish remains to honor the families of Fontainebleau and beyond. By you listening in today, I hope that together we have all helped cement their legacy for future generations. Thank you for your time. Have a nice day.